HMS Roberts and her sister Abercrombie were the last 15-inch monitors built for the Royal Navy. As the Second World War was beginning, and Winston Churchill retook his post as First Lord of the Admiralty, as in the First World War, he looked to familiarize himself with the ships of the Royal Navy, and especially the monitor fleet he had helped to create in 1914 and 1915. Where by the end of the war, the Royal Navy had some 40 monitors to bombard the occupied Belgian coast and Ottoman coastline in the Gallipoli campaign. However, when he looked in September 1939, he found very few, as many had been scrapped in the interwar period, with only several like Erebus, Marshal Soult, Marshal Ney, and several others still left in service. With Germany likely striking France through the Low Countries, Churchill realized coastal bombardment vessels could play a useful role once again there, or other possible theaters of the war, like the shallow waters of the southern North Sea, or even in the Baltic. This led him to desire the creation of new monitors, and specifically in this video, HMS Roberts. Being laid down in April 1940, and through using the guns of Soult, Roberts was armed and after entering service in 1941, was used in the Mediterranean with operations like Torch, Husky, or later the invasion of Western Europe and further operations. After the war, she served as a training ship, surviving until 1965, and because of her 15-inch guns, she was the last surviving big gun ship left in the Royal Navy when she was scrapped in 1965. Going back to the origins of the Monitor as a quick refresher, the idea of a small ship with a big gun and a shallow draft was a concept that can be roughly traced back to the Age of Sail, when British and French forces used bomb vessels at the end of the 17th century to bombard forts at places like Tripoli and Genoa. In the Iron and Steam Age, these vessels came to be in the Crimean War, and especially the American Civil War. With this in mind, in the stalemate of the First World War, the Admiralty in November 1914, now under the control of Admiral Jackie Fisher as the First Sea Lord, and Winston Churchill as the First Lord, desired to find a way to break the stalemate that had already set in using the Grand Fleet. They wanted to strike Germany decisively in a vulnerable spot. An interesting point in the development of Royal Navy monitors is in November 1914, when Charles Schwab, yes, that one, was on RMS Olympic and witnessed the sinking of HMS Audacious, north of Ireland. Schwab was there to sell arms to Britain. Once Jellicoe had released him and the other passengers, he went and talked to Churchill, where he offered to sell him the 14-inch guns Bethlehem Steelworks was building for the Greek battleship Salamis in Germany. As long as the British blockade withstood, Schwab was happy to sell them to Churchill, and the idea of the first British monitors was conceived. To quote Big Gun Monitors, Design, Construction, and Operations 1914 to 1945 by Ian Buxton, by the standards of Ericsson's original design, the British concept was not strictly a monitor, but over the intervening half-century, the term could reasonably be considered as having evolved somewhat to embrace a new type which still owed something of its characteristics to the first monitor. Within the Royal Navy, the description monitor would be distinctive and unambiguous, while not giving away too much as to their expected operational role. As I mentioned previously, the Royal Navy built many monitors during the First World War, like HMS Lord Clive, who was eventually armed with an 18-inch gun. My video on her can be found in the description. Anyway, the Royal Navy built monitors armed with 14-inch, 12-inch, 15-inch, 18-inch, and others with odd caliber guns like HMS Glatton, originally built as a Norwegian coastal defense ship. But by the time the Second World War kicked off in September 1939, that number had been reduced drastically, and so had the stockpile of spare large caliber guns, meaning that for future vessels, it would be hard to find spare guns lying around for new monitors. Even the monitors on hand weren't in the best condition, Erebus being the best one. Others, like Marshal Soult, were in very poor condition, and by November 1939, Churchill was very anxious to have more monitors ready for service. With this in mind, a detailed survey of Soult was carried out, and it showed it was not worth reconstructing her. Still, as her turret was in reasonable enough condition, her twin 15-inch guns could be transferred to a new hull with more modern and powerful machinery. Preliminary design work began right away, and various proposals were developed to get 15-knot speed if possible. Taking hull lines derived from Erebus, the best build of the World War I monitors, it was estimated that 12 knots could be obtained on trials with about 3,500 horsepower, and an idea that was thought of with Lord Clive and the 12-inch monitors from the First World War, the machinery could be possibly diesel. Like those 12-inch monitors, Roberts would not get diesels. This time, the reason being was the diesels would take longer to build than steam turbines. And with the ship needing to be delivered in 12 months, the quicker the better, and so steam turbines were used. Also, like the World War I ships, Roberts' design incorporated a torpedo bulge, which would provide good protection against torpedoes and mines for the 54-foot wide main hull. Her machinery spaces were smaller than Erebus, as she only had to accommodate 2 boilers on a preliminary displacement of 8,380 tons. A difference between the World War I vintage monitors and Roberts is how the protection was designed and constructed, as it took into consideration the threat of air attack, but otherwise they were very similar. The vertical protection was designed to resist a 6-inch naval gun or a 9-inch howitzer striking normally at 90 degrees. The horizontal protection was disposed at an angle of about 35 degrees to the horizontal, corresponding to the angle of descent of long-range projectiles. The side protection system below the water was designed on the pattern of the new King George V class battleships and fleet carriers under construction at the time, where Buxton again writes, "A 17-foot wide sandwich layer was arranged in the bulge abreast the vitals of the ship, consisting of an outer airspace, a jacket space partially filled with water, and an inner airspace, giving protection against torpedoes carrying a 1,000-pound warhead. The theory was that the detonation should take place as far as possible from the main hull proper. The outer airspace served to reduce the pressure pulse set up in the sea by the explosion. The middle water space or jacket absorbed, distributed, and dispersed the energy of the explosion over a wide area and reduced the momentum of splinters. The inner air jacket prevented the pressure waves in the water jacket from being transmitted to the protective bulkhead. Another change was that the protection was fitted on the main deck rather than the upper deck to reduce the height of the side armor. The forecastle deck extended right to the stern, unlike the World War I ships, with that level now being the upper deck and the old upper deck now being the main deck. Another interesting change was that of the conning tower, where the old cramped and uncomfortable circular conning tower of the World War I designs was dropped in favor of an armored compartment built into the bridge structure below the compass platform, as in the new battleships. As I previously stated, the main armament came from Marshal Soult, and although it was 25 years old, the 15-inch gun was still very effective. Apart from an overhaul and several modifications to load the new 15-inch ammunition, the turret was good to go for the ship. New fire control systems would be installed to modernize the battery further. As in the World War I monitors, Roberts would need other smaller caliber guns, and considering that she would likely be conducting offensive operations near an enemy's coast, she would need lots of anti-aircraft guns. The original suggestion of 6 high-angle guns as in Erebus and Terror was soon regarded as not adequate for Roberts. Others suggested the new 4.5-inch high-angle guns being fitted to the capital ships. Still, they were all being used by them, so the only remaining option was the twin 4-inch dual-purpose guns that formed the secondary battery of the cruisers. 2 twin 4-inch mountings were added on the port and starboard sides abreast the funnel. Light anti-aircraft guns were added as well, like the 2-pounder, with the 1/2-inch machine gun being rejected. This would be further augmented throughout her career, including during her construction. The design work continued on the ship, and tweaks were made. The displacement crept to 8,675 tons, with a standard displacement of 7,505 tons. Some objections were raised to building a monitor at all, as the armor and other materials could be allocated elsewhere. These objections were overruled, and the design and the eventual construction of the ship continued. There were delays due to the shipment of components for the 15-inch turret, as they were being shipped on the newly built coaster Goodwood. The parts on the ship shifted so violently that the crew thought the ship was sinking and abandoned ship. Once they realized their ship was not sinking, they sailed on, although it did take some time for them to realize. A new problem arose of where they were going to be stored, as the cranes were all being used at the time. There were several weeks worth of delays, but some good news did come out of it. 8 single 20mm Oerlikons were added to the armament. Some more delays followed due to several factors, including modifications during the construction. But by October 1941, Roberts commissioned into the Royal Navy, where Buxton writes, "Although the layout of Roberts was similar to that of Erebus, there was no mistaking the final appearance of the two ships. The profile of the World War I monitor as built was bare. Virtually, the only erections above the deck were the turret, bridge, mast, and funnel. although subsequently extended during World War II. In contrast, Roberts had an extensive superstructure, her two masts and her radar aerials, considerable AA armament, a flush upper deck, and an external sloping armor belt on top of the bulge. Roberts was laid down on the 30th of April 1940, launched on February 1st, 1941, and completed on the 27th of October 1941. She displaced 7,973 tons standard and 9,150 tons full load. Her armament as completed was her 15-inch turret forward, 4 twin 4-inch mountings, 16 2-pounders, 2 quad and 1 octuple mounting, and 8 single 20mm Oerlikons. As for machinery, 2 boilers provided steam for twin Parsons single reduction geared turbines for about 4,800 shaft horsepower, and on trial she achieved 13.5 knots. Her armor consisted of a deck that varied between 3 inches and 6 inches, with the belt armor ranging from 4 inches to 5 inches. The main battery turret had a face thickness of 13 inches, sides of 11 inches, rear of 5 inches, and a roof of 3 inches. Roberts finally commissioned on October 6, 1941. She left Clydebank for a short dry dock period, and then official trials began on October 26th, where her speed trials and gunnery trials took place, all of which were successful. Some minor adjustments to the guns followed, but by November the 13th, she was heading to the Mediterranean Sea via the Cape of Good Hope to replace HMS Terror, which was lost 9 months earlier, 1940. Something interesting that I'd like to mention is that Roberts' sister ship, HMS Abercrombie, got her guns from a spare originally built for one of the large light cruisers. I'll tell you what, it's hard to get away from those large light cruisers when talking about odd Royal Navy ships of the period. Abercrombie would enter service in 1943 and serve into the 1950s. But getting back to Roberts in 1941, she and Erebus left on December 1st, stopping first at the Azores, and then slowly but surely making their way around Africa, making sure to get in some much-needed gunnery practice along the way. With only a slight delay at Durban due to some boiler troubles, Roberts made it to the Mediterranean on February 26, 1942. Things in the African campaign weren't going so great, as Erwin Rommel was pushing the 8th Army back, and the Luftwaffe was bombing and mining the Suez. Roberts stayed there for a time serving as an anti-aircraft ship. Few air attacks would come in the 5 scorching hot months she was stationed at this post. When she did finally move again, she was moved into the Red Sea for a few weeks to work back up. In August, she was ordered to sail for an operation, having to go back to Durban, South Africa for a much-needed defouling, as she had lost 2 knots speed from lying at anchor. After leaving Durban for Freetown, her crew learned they were going to take part in Operation Torch. Roberts arrived at Gibraltar on November 2nd, along with a vast majority of the Allied covering naval and air forces who were gathering for the invasion, due to take place on the 8th of November, 1942. Roberts left Gibraltar as part of convoy KMS A.1. Roberts was part of the force that was to land at Algiers, carrying the largest guns to suppress Vichy French forces guarding the North African city, as the battleships of the covering force were further seaward in case the Regia Marina sortied to meet the invasion. That invasion kicked off at 1 a.m. on the 8th in 3 sectors, 2 to the west and 1 to the east. Roberts took up station about 7 miles off the coast, where she was ready to provide support to the western sectors. However, little resistance was encountered in those western sectors, so Roberts wasn't required to do anything. To the east there was more resistance, where cruiser gunfire, destroyer gunfire, and aircraft were sufficient in suppressing the opposition. Since there was such little resistance, Roberts could anchor safely and act as a radar guard ship, warning of approaching German aircraft from the direction of Tunisia, defending against those German aircraft the following day in Algiers Bay. Roberts came up the coast as further landings occurred near what today is Bahia on the 11th, again not requiring the guns of Roberts. In the afternoon of the 11th, like in Algiers, Roberts and the other ships of the invasion force came under attack by German aircraft, helping to beat off the first wave of Ju-88s and claiming to have shot down one. Near dusk, another wave of attackers appeared, and despite concentrated anti-aircraft fire, some troop ships were sunk. At 5:15, Roberts came under attack by 3 Ju-88s, one attack from the bow and the other 2 from the stern. One bomb was a near miss, but the other 2 were direct hits. Casualties were heavy, although her protection system saved her from sinking. Where Buxton writes, "One bomb hit her sloping bulge armor on the port side abreast the funnel. dishing the 4-inch thick plate about 10 inches and flooding 2 of the inner bulge compartments. A hole about 7 feet by 6 feet was blown in the ship's side, starting a fire on the main deck. The second hit was more serious. The bomb landed just abaft the funnel and penetrated as far as the armored main deck. The explosion wrecked compartments above the main deck and started fires. Roberts had considerable damage, with 17 dead and 35 wounded, and the ship was immobilized for 2 days due to the damage she suffered. Although immobilized, Roberts was able to provide a formidable anti-aircraft barrage, and once new engine room fans were improvised from mess deck fans, she was able to move again. On the 16th, Roberts avoided 2 torpedoes dropped by aircraft near Bahia. Some of the minor damage from the air attacks was also patched up by the crew, using mattress frames with concrete to patch holes in the upper deck while staying as a radar/AA ship until the 22nd, where eventually she was relieved and first sent back to Algiers and then on to Liverpool for repairs on January 6, 1943. These repairs lasted until the end of May 1943, just in time to take part in the next phase in the Mediterranean theater, the invasion of Sicily or Operation Husky. Interestingly enough, Roberts arrived in Clyde with a new captain, Captain Ronald Ernest Cotton Dunbar, who was the navigating officer in Lord Clive at the end of the First World War, linked to her weird life in the description. Anyway, Roberts, Abercrombie, and Erebus had been allocated to provide fire support for the invasions. While en route, Roberts suffered damage to her turbo generators, needing one to be replaced. Still, she soldiered on with one. Arriving at Algiers on July 2nd, Roberts joined up with the convoy KMS .18B, leaving on the 8th to rendezvous with said convoy. At midday on the 9th, she switched convoys to KMF .18 for the final run-in, having some difficulty keeping up with the faster ships. Late in the afternoon of the 10th, Roberts, assisting with the British and Canadian landings, opened up on the battery near Paquino, being silenced by 14 rounds from Roberts, continuing to assist when required until the 13th, when she was transferred to Syracuse to guard the port from air attack. The following day, she was sent to Catania to relieve Erebus, where she wasn't needed due to the lack of information on Allied troop positions and other factors. The next day, she was more successful, firing some 90 rounds at Catania. The longest range salvos were fired from 25,000 yards out at the town of Mista Bianco, where one of the targets was the base of a chimney, and on the first shot, she hit the base of the chimney and collapsed it into a heap of bricks. A malfunction with her main battery caused her to withdraw and head for Gibraltar, where she joined the other 2 monitors on the 16th. The monitors carried out several bombardments of German positions on Sicily in August, but by the end of the month, the Allies were preparing for the invasion of Italy proper. The Allies were planning the invasion of the mainland as soon as the necessary forces could be assembled, meaning that Roberts and the other monitors would have work to do. Roberts was allocated to support the British landings at the northern end of the Gulf of Salerno, departing Bizerta on the morning of the 7th of September. As the landing forces were departing, news of the armistice with the Italian government was broadcast, giving them some optimism that there would be less resistance. But the Germans at Salerno were well prepared. Early on the morning of the 9th, Roberts got busy alongside 4 cruisers firing on German positions east of the town with some success. The next day, she was to bombard the road through Cava, about 5 miles northwest of Salerno, putting up some impressive numbers, firing 19 rounds in 5-minute intervals. There were issues with spotting that day, and Roberts had issues herself with some of her equipment, and then a shell leaving the right barrel damaged it as it exited, so the rest of the shoot was done with the left barrel exclusively. More shoots were scheduled on the following days, but when a heavy German counterattack came on the 14th, Roberts wasn't needed because there were so many other ships involved. During her time near Salerno, like in North Africa, she came under German air attack and managed to shoot down a Bf-109. After a short respite between the 14th and 16th of September, she was back bombarding German positions in and around Cava, expending over 200 rounds of ammunition, assisting the advancing Allies. She did leave on the 19th for Malta, as she had expended almost all of her ammunition. Having expended so many shells like the other monitors, Roberts required new guns, and don't forget, she still needed her turbo generator fixed. So, to get these critical parts of the ship fixed, she headed to Egypt in October, where, to skip ahead and jump to just before Operation Neptune, the Allies recognized the final defeat of Germany would require the invasion of Western Europe, in which to penetrate the German defenses, they would need a lot of firepower. In addition to air power and smaller vessels that could get closer to shore, like destroyers and other smaller craft, there were quite a few battleships that were going to provide gun support and monitors. Where Jim Crosley and Monitors of the Royal Navy, How the Fleet Brought the Great Guns to Bear writes, in order to make the most of Allied naval firepower during the training for the D-Day operation, particular emphasis was placed on getting good communications established with spotting aircraft, normally Spitfires. The battleships training for shore bombardment alongside the Monitors were an elderly bunch. There was Rodney, laid down in 1922, Ramillies, 1913, and USS Texas, 1911. Nevertheless, they were all twice as fast as Erebus and Roberts, and of course they had heavier protective armor. The squadron was joined by Roberts in May 1944, and this venerable force steamed south at the end of the month to take their place supporting the Allied landings. Buxton next writes, the strongest bombardment fleet was assigned to the easternmost of the 5 landing beaches, codenamed Sword, as not only were the coast defenses strongest here, but the Germans were likely to defend nearby Caen most stubbornly, as it blocked the direct route to Paris. Roberts, Warspite, and Ramillies, plus 6 cruisers were allocated to this sector as a bombarding force D of the Eastern Task Force, each ship being assigned one particular heavy battery as its principal target on D-Day. The Allies planned to give the bombardment force ample time to soften up the German defenses before the invasion forces landed. Roberts anchored off her firing position 11 miles west of Le Havre at 5:20 a.m. on June 6, 1944, and just 3 minutes later, she would open fire on Ulgat Battery, which had 4 6.1-inch guns 10 miles east of Sword Beach. 2 were in casements and 2 in concrete pits. Aircraft dropped smoke to cover the bombardment force. Remember, they had spotters. Owing to the effectiveness of the smokescreen, electronic countermeasures to the German radar, the bombardment force got to work. German torpedo boats did sortie from Le Havre and fire torpedoes. 2 came dangerously close to Roberts, having to get underway rather quickly, keeping up her fire as she maneuvered. Roberts maintained heavy fire, firing 27 rounds during this period. There were some difficulties in spotting owing to a German smokescreen and a failure of some of the APC rounds to detonate in the marshy ground. While the landings came, Roberts fired periodically throughout the morning to silence German guns. During the afternoon, Roberts was very successful in firing at the Ulgat Battery. After just 16 rounds, the spotters reported several direct hits and 2 large explosions. At 11:30 p.m., she fired at a troop concentration when a huge chunk of metal went up into the air in front of the bridge of the ship. Fire was ceased immediately, and it was found the right 15-inch gun had burst its jacket. Something similar had happened to Erebus earlier in the day. The jacket split in several places, and to prevent further damage, it was strapped together with a wire rope, putting an end to Roberts' action on D-Day as she headed to Portsmouth. When she was inspected at Portsmouth, it was decided to defer changing it until the left gun was worn, and she sailed out again for Seine Bay early on the 9th of June with only one 15-inch gun operational. She arrived just in time to defend against German counterattacks. On the 10th, she moved to Gold Beach, a few miles to the west, to support the 6th Armored Division's thrust towards Villers-Bocage, southwest of Caen, as they were getting out of range of the cruiser's guns. For the next 2.5 days, Roberts' single 15-inch gun fired on concentrations of German troops, strong points, road junctions, mobile batteries, and motor transports about 11 miles to the west of Caen. On the 12th, Roberts was continuing her bombardment operations as Prime Minister Winston Churchill was paying a visit to the bombardment fleet in the afternoon. His ship happened to be passing alongside when Roberts received an order to fire on German positions near Juvigny Church, making the Prime Minister's VIP somewhat disconcerted. Another 2 days passed before Roberts was recalled to Portsmouth, as smaller caliber guns could tackle some of the Army's needs. Heading to Portsmouth to replenish her ammunition and finally getting those barrels exchanged. The ship returned to the eastern flank of the invasion on the 21st of June to support the advance onto the River Orne, 10 miles to the northeast of Caen. During these first 3 days back on station, she fired some 80 rounds at enemy positions. On the 26th, she supported Operation Epsom, the advance over the River Odon, where she was requested to fire some 100 rounds at German positions. Due to issues with her spotters, a majority of her fall of shot was unobserved. With the month wrapping up and it being relatively quiet, Roberts returned to Portsmouth on July 1st to replenish her ammunition again. When she returned, she and other ships were to support the advance on Caen itself, helping to bombard the defenses around the city when Buxton writes, "The British and Canadian attack started on July 8th, with naval gunfire backing the bombing and artillery barrage. When the Canadian 3rd Division asked for support when being heavily counterattacked, Roberts directed some 40 rounds onto the road junction through which the German reinforcements were moving. The target was just outside the range of her guns, but as it would take too long to flood the bulges to heal the ship, her gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander H.S. Witteau, obtained the extra elevation by using an initial salvo to get the ship rolling, then timed the firing of each subsequent round to the extremity of the roll. So impressed were the Canadians by the shooting that they sent a party of 80 out to thank the Monitor's crew personally. Caen was entered the next day, although the German defenses south of the Orne remained stubborn. Over the next 2 weeks, Roberts continued to engage German positions, but by the 23rd of July, with the Allies advancing out of the range of her guns, she returned to Portsmouth. The next big mission for Roberts was in early November 1944, where she was to bombard any batteries around Zeebrugge that might still be holding out, a familiar place for British monitors. In company with Erebus and Warspite, they were to assist in the landing of Royal Marine Commandos near Westkapelle. On November 1st at 8:15 a.m., Warspite and Roberts opened up on German positions, with Warspite taking on German guns and Roberts taking on a radar station first. After 5 rounds, she switched to a coastal battery at Westkapelle, which had ex-British guns. The ships kept up a steady fire until the late morning when fog impaired their spotting. Once it lifted in the early afternoon, they continued to provide accurate gunfire until the evening when they returned to the United Kingdom for fear of torpedo attacks. The ships returned the next day to attack other German batteries. And once the final battery was captured in the afternoon, the ships returned to the UK as there was no need for further bombardment support. The remainder of the war was rather mundane for Roberts, as she was no longer needed for bombardment missions in European waters, as the Allies pushed into Germany. In the early months of 1945, there were some thoughts of bombarding Hamburg, but with the collapse of Germany in May, there was no need. The monitors were soon allocated to the Eastern Fleet to support further attacks on Japan, but Roberts never made it to the Pacific as the war had ended. Roberts survived the war considerably longer than her sister, the other monitors, and a vast majority of Britain's capital ships. She arrived in Devonport on the 22nd of November, 1945, where she remained for the next 2 decades. Initially, she was a turret drill ship with a complement of 120, and later an accommodation ship for the Reserve Fleet Base Orion, with a crew of about 40. By 1955, she was removed from the official strength of the fleet, but she continued to be useful at the dockyard, remaining in the role of part living ship, part fender ship until 1965 when she was scrapped. I think Buxton writes a very nice end to the ship. Her distinctive profile with the prominent spotting top and the raised turret made her a familiar sight to a generation of sailors at Devonport. To the older ones, she was a reminder of the big gun ships in which most had once served. To the younger ones, who would never see a British battleship, she gave a fleeting impression of the naval might that had once dominated the seas. I hope you all enjoyed this extended look at HMS Roberts. After the video on HMS Lord Clive, I got many comments requesting this ship be the next monitor the channel covers. She certainly had an interesting career and a beautiful design, and I really do think it's a shame she was not preserved as a museum ship, because she wasn't that big, and I mean, if they could keep Belfast. Anyway, thank you all for watching, and please remember to like and subscribe as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great day.